someone who wants to become a game developer, is it important that they study in university? And if yes, what should they study? Should they study computer science or something else like game design?
It depends. If you're going to go to school, I would definitely suggest not just doing.
In this episode of the Coding and Flow podcast, I will be talking to Harrison Ferrone, who is an iOS and Unity developer, ex-Microsoft technical writer, and also a best-selling author. And he has recently released the newest version of his book, Learning C# by Developing Games with Unity, version 2021. And in this episode, we will talk about everything you need to know if you want to get started with Unity development. We will talk about his book and learning strategies for beginners. We will also talk about things like, do you need to study in university to become a game developer? Also, do you need to be good at math? And how realistic is it to become successful in the indie game market? Can you actually build your very own games without having a job at a company? We will talk about questions like this. And full disclosure, this is a sponsored video. They paid me to do this interview. Now I wanted to do an interview with a Unity developer anyway, and I think I did this interview in a really unbiased way, the same way I do on my other podcast interviews, but I just have to disclose that this is advertisement. I get compensated to do this interview and to promote this book. And in the video description below, you will find a link to the book with a discount code, so you can get it for a lower price. And then I wish you a lot of fun with this interview. So I like to start the episode with the guest saying a few words about their personal life, as much as you're comfortable with sharing. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you do in your free time, what your hobbies are, and also how you got into programming and
Sure.
when you got into programming.
Okay. Well, most of my free time is spent programming or writing. I love Funko Pops, so I collect these little guys. Read a lot of comics. Play with my cats. I like a quiet life. But let's see. So I got into programming, like 10 years ago. Now thinking about it, it's a long time ago. I went to school for English, actually, for my first degree, and kind of fell into a programming boot camp after that because I, sort of needed a job and some tech skills, and learned how to do iOS development with Objective-C and Swift. And then sort of migrated into teaching and writing and developing, and finally got hooked up in Unity and C# and kind of never looked back. I mean, I do mostly it's only mobile or Unity right now, like for the past 5 or 6 years.
Oh, you mentioned you have experience with iOS development. Does this also include app development or just games?
No, I actually started out as an iOS app developer for several years. I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Chicago. I was their in-house iOS developer. I've taught a bunch of courses on iOS, mostly with Swift and a little bit of Agile. But I haven't done most of the iOS stuff I do now is just for myself or consulting work. But mainly I've been focusing on teaching game development in Unity for the past several years.
So, and you enjoy game development more, I suppose, than app development?
Ooh, it's a toss-up because I love Swift. So if I could make games in Unity with Swift, I would do that. But game development definitely is more where, I don't know, I see the potential for me, enjoying my work more. But I do love app development just because there's, I like building systems, and it's a lot, I don't know, I wouldn't say easier, but at least with mobile development, you don't have to deal with, like game objects on the screen. So it's a little easier to build, like say a networking layer, which is something, I would find, amusing on a weekend. And in Unity, that's a little bit harder. You have to deal with a lot of secondary concerns.
And you have written quite a big book about Unity development. This is what we want to talk about here in this episode. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to give us some overview about the topics you cover there and the general approach of this book.
Sure. So when I learned Unity, it was really difficult because Unity was still pretty small. They had a very, kind of small market share, and they were sort of considered, back, 8-9 years ago, they were the hobbyist engine. So there wasn't a lot of, they didn't have Unity Learn, that didn't exist. They didn't have everything you could either kind of find on YouTube or, occasionally some blog posts. So I wrote the book I would have wanted like 10 years ago when I was learning Unity and how to program. And I sort of wish I had started, with C#. I started with C++, which it's kind of a hard language to learn for your first time. There's a lot of memory management that, doesn't come naturally usually to people like starting out programming. So the book I wrote basically assumes you have zero programming experience. We start super basic. We go through kind of we're already all programmers. Like that's how brains work. You take input, you make decisions, and then you execute them. So it's pretty like it's not this giant leap if you take it kind of step by step. So we start with basics. You learn how to write variables and some easy methods. We go into a little bit of object-oriented stuff in the beginning, not too much, just enough to know, you could have an animal class and there could be several types of animals and each animal could have its own behavior and easy concepts like that aren't like fully implemented in a game yet. And then we kind of build out, like a first-person shooter prototype. And, we talk a little bit about game design, not too much, but we do spend about half a chapter doing that. And then we kind of dive in. We white box a little arena. You get your player moving. You add some jumping and shooting mechanics. We make a kind of smart enemy. It's not terribly smart, but it does it's kind of like a seek and destroy sort of thing. So if it has a really big radius and it's using Unity's navigation API. So basically the arena is walkable. Unity knows that. And if you, walk within a certain range of the enemy, it kind of chases you. And if you exit it, it kind of goes back to patrolling the area. And it all turns out, into this fun little playable prototype. We go into some intermediate stuff in the end of the book. We talk about some, sort of advanced collection types. And then we go into data management, which is the new chapter in this new edition for Unity 2021. And we've got kind of a monster chapter on how to, load and save basically text, JSON, or XML data, which is everything you would need to keep track of your players or build custom levels or anything that you have to do with data, because games, everything runs on data. So I felt that was really missing from the new edition, or from the previous editions, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I've read some parts of the book. I haven't read the whole book because at the moment
Sorry,
myself,
it's a big one.
yeah, it's quite a big book actually. I have the physical copy here. It's quite big. But what I really like is that you explain stuff in simple English terms so people can understand them. This is what many instructors are missing. They become kind of blind for how this stuff looks for a beginner. They lose this beginner mindset.
Yeah.
And in your book, you really explain stuff in simple English terms. And this is also what I try to do in my videos, because I think it's important. Yeah, otherwise people don't get it.
Yeah, writing with as little assumptions, or teaching with as little assumptions as possible is the key to actually getting people to learn. Because if you're just assuming that they know things, that's a crapshoot. You could be totally wrong. So I totally agree.
Yeah, it's important, but it's also difficult at the same time. I noticed this myself.
It's very difficult.
There are some topics now where I'm more advanced than I've been a few years ago, where I was still a complete beginner in my tutorials. And I noticed that you start to forget mentioning things that it's important to understand for beginners. Because things like variables and functions, they are second nature now for us, but we must not forget...
It's like talking.
Yeah, but we must not forget that it's not so obvious for beginners, right? And I think you handle this quite well from the parts I've read. And you also have these little pop quizzes and heroes trials, right? Mm-hmm. Which are basically there to cement the knowledge at the end of a chapter.
Yeah, so we have some, like, the pop quizzes are just sort of, personally, I like testing myself just with sort of objective knowledge. So we have pop quizzes. And we also, like you mentioned, we have the Heroes Trials, which are basically, the answers are, are covered in the book, or they're online in the code repository, but they're basically kind of extra stretch goals. And you can, it's like, well, why don't you animate something? We've already showed you how to animate something, but why don't you go animate something on your own, in the game? So they're not required, but they are. I have received a lot of feedback and emails and things about, that's really where the cementing comes in, is like having to do it yourself, having about 80% of the knowledge that you need and figuring out the other 20%. And usually that's a pretty good balance there for learning a new skill. 80 to 90% known, 20 to 10% unknown.
Yeah, I've also in some of my tutorials, I've also added some homeworks where people have to think for themselves. That's important. Otherwise, it's too easy that you just type out what's written in the book and then you don't remember anything. So it's really important to have these little tasks for yourself.
Exactly. Coding by numbers, I mean, it could be fun for a little while, but it doesn't really help you.
Yeah. And how much would you say from the book in percent is theory and how much is like building a real game hands-on? Or can't you put a number on there?
Ooh, I don't know. I try and do it. I know this doesn't make mathematical sense, but I think it's both, because every time we introduce a theory after, chapter 2 or 3, we're actually building it.
Okay, yeah.
So
makes sense.
Maybe half and half, but I really think there's a lot more as we move through the book. It definitely takes a turn. You do have much more implementation, because we're not just coding, but we're dealing with the Unity interface, and we're like building things and adding objects and animating a little bit. So it's, as the book moves through, it definitely goes from 100% theory in that first 2 or 3 chapters to almost all implementation, because by the end, if you've been working through it kind of diligently, you're up to speed with what we're talking about. We don't really introduce any new like paradigms by the middle or end of the book, because we're kind of in that object-oriented mindset, and everything is based off that or the Unity, like the entity component system.
Okay, so of course, being a game developer is a dream job for many people, and
it's still a dream job for me. I haven't quite gotten there yet.
let's talk a little bit about the job market, maybe, and let's start with someone who wants to become a game developer. Is it important that they study in university? And if yes, what should they study? Should they study computer science or something else like game design? What do you think?
Oh, that's a hard one, because I tried that route. I have a game design degree, and I didn't learn too much programming because the curriculum was very new back then. So it depends. If you're going to go to school, I would definitely suggest not just doing design, because that's going to be really hard to find a job unless you kind of get lucky and or you have a really good network, which it's totally possible. But I don't think anybody in games, even artists, should probably understand how, like, they don't need to know how to code, but you should at least know how code works, how computers work, how this all kind of translates into the playable product. So whichever route you're going, programming is usually fundamental. And if you want to do game design, that's awesome too. I would say, again, if you are going to the university route, you'll learn the most by doing projects. So you can't depend on, unfortunately, this is one of those careers where you need a lot of time kind of breaking things and getting stuck. And it helps if you have, 1 or 2 people that are like teammates and peers to like kind of go through that with you. Now, if you're not going to go to, university, you're going to do a boot camp, or you're just going to do self-taught learning. I mean, with everything that's out there right now, that's totally possible. I mean, MIT has open courseware. You can learn, everything you need to know about computer science for free if you really, wanted to go at it.
So it is possible to get a job if you're self-taught in game development. It's not like you need a CS degree. Okay.
No, not at all. Most, actually, like, I find that computer science topics are actually missing from a lot of people who do game programming and game development, because they usually don't go into the computer science fields they go into a separate kind of half and half, like design or game programming curriculum at a school at least. And so, I mean, it would be great if we had a little more computer science in game development, I think.
What I read online on Reddit, I think, is when I Googled this question earlier, is that some people recommend to study computer science because you can still fall back to becoming an app developer if you don't find a job in game development, which you can't
It's
do
very
with game
true.
design, right?
Exactly. So that's, yeah, again, it's like game design is very specialized, so it's a gamble. And I
Yeah.
think that's a disservice for universities to kind of pitch that without any kind of fundamentals. And most curriculums, nowadays that I've been looking at, seem to have figured that out. Like not a lot of people go through without at least touching some code. But it's definitely, especially if you're self-taught, like if you're learning C# and Unity, or like read my book or somebody else's book, you can totally take that and start making C# console applications if you want it, or app development, or anything like that.
How is the job market in general? Is it realistic today to get a job in game development, or are there too few jobs? How do you think is the situation?
What I've noticed, and the reason why I don't have or haven't pursued that as much, is because I've seen a lot of people have to get in through QA, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that is a lot of time that you have to spend not doing what you want to do.
What does this mean exactly when you
I'm sorry, quality assurance. So they're testing. So a lot of programmers and designers and artists get into the industry through these quality assurance jobs, and you're testing. And sometimes as you move up, you're writing tests, you're managing groups of testers, and then eventually, hopefully you get into the design or programming side. It is possible to jump right to a design or programming role. It's very difficult. Again, you have to really network, and it's very important to have, I would say, a lot of, like, a few core projects on your GitHub or something, because it's very hard to get out of school with this kind of degree and jump right into the industry without, some really good examples of what you can do. And if you're self-taught, I mean, that you're kind of in the same boat. You just need to start, and you need to keep making things.
So building projects for your portfolio is a good idea, just like in app development.
Yeah.
And how big should they be? Is it enough to watch a beginner tutorial and build a small project? Yeah. You don't need to build a full game with story and everything.
No.
Okay.
No, not at all. I've gotten this question a few times, and I've helped a couple people do their portfolios. My approach, especially with Unity, it makes it kind of nice, because each, games like full AAA or full bodied games can be broken down into several core elements, right? So a good core project could be like, make a really cool player movement and camera controller. Like, that is, like, you could have it with, a capsule. You don't have to have game art or anything, but if it works and it's showing some interesting functionality and you're mastering, if you can show, some good clean code, maybe some design patterns, if you're at that level, like, that's perfectly fine. If you want to do, like, just a user interface that has a really great background layer that manages all the game's data, great. That's, a small piece. If you want to do an enemy mechanic or even a player mechanic, like I said, they don't have to be full games. They need to be full features, though. So, like, full core components or features of a game. That really shows, like, if you were employers are looking for, if they dropped you into a team right now, how much would they have to teach you, right? How much would it cost them to get you up to speed and producing meaningful work? And from my perspective, if you can show, these small core projects, that's a pretty good indicator that, like, you can create something that's sort of, that's complete, but, meaningful to a game. Like, nobody now programs an entire game, like, at a high level, like indie developers do, but no one person is responsible for, like, a massive game. You break out the teams into components, or the components into teams, and then they make, each small thing, and you put it together.
Yeah, that makes sense. And If someone starts at zero today, how long should they expect it takes them to get job ready?
Ooh, it depends on the person, but I would say, I mean, at 6 months of really like diligent kind of work on your own, and just for trying to get a general like entry level software development job with C Sharp, like 6 to 9 months, I think that's doable. I mean, you can't really quote me on that because that's different in every country, but Unity is a little bit, it's difficult. You can freelance anytime you want. I mean, technically, and Unity jobs are skyrocketing. Everyone needs a Unity developer because you can do so much with Unity. So I wouldn't, if you were just starting out and you had 6 months to a year of C Sharp and Unity experience, I wouldn't limit yourself to just applying for game jobs. I would look for any company that's like doing commercial visualization or like VR walkthroughs of real estate or any kind of simulation work, even if it's weird and not games. Like it doesn't matter if you get that experience under your belt where a client comes to you and says, I need this visualized in 3D and I need this and I need this, and they have a core feature list, and you implement that successfully. I mean, even if it's not a playable game and it's, like a commercial simulation, that's still technically, a game to me in terms of how you make it. So don't limit yourself to just applying for game companies, because that's going to be tough in any market.
So there are also offers on freelance sites. So it has a healthy freelance market, if I understand this correctly.
Yeah.
And so this is also an option maybe for people who don't want to work in a company. Or would you recommend working in a company?
Honestly, I would recommend working at a company just to learn the logistics of how a business like this works. If you already have experience freelancing, go for it. Like if you already know how to pull, kind of like template contracts, how to do, set up your LLC, how to do your own taxes. Like if you know how to have put together a client pitch deck, these things you learn naturally if you work at a company. But if you already have experience with that, or if you learn it on your own, like go for it. Start freelancing. It can't, as long as you do it with integrity, it can't really hurt you. If you're upfront about your skills and you stick to, doing what you said, go for it.
And also one important question that often comes up is, how important is math in game development? Do you have to be a math genius?
Ooh, I get this one all the time.
Yeah, it's definitely more important than in app development, right? Because at least you have to work a little bit with physics and stuff like that. So you need some basic math.
Sure. You need like, human math. And when I say that, I mean like when you get up, when you stand up, that you're exerting force to stand up, right? You turn, okay, I'm rotating technically. These things that we, again, naturally do, like the way our minds naturally work in three-dimensional space, is almost all you need because, well, especially with something like Unity, because Unity wraps a lot of their math into classes that you can use. So you don't need to know vector. I mean, it helps to know vector math, like the basics of it, but like all that, anything complicated can be looked up online, or like, you can take a small course or read a book, but like that's really if you like it. Like I've never had to struggle through like, going and learning, like taking a class just for game development for math. Like everything, especially in Unity, that you do in real life, they've made it very, intuitive, with a lot of their stuff that they offer. That's, they kind of hide the crazy math and they say, well, what do you want to do? Say, well, I want to create a 3D, a dot. Yeah. Say, okay, well, from your, middle school, Cartesian coordinates, that takes an X and a Y in 2D and a Z in 3D. Great. Put in 3 numbers and it creates a point for you. There's not, when you get into things like, well, I want, the player to always, or the enemy to always look at the player, or I want the camera to do something like, to be offset and kind of hover all the time. That kind of stuff, again, is totally out there, right? Like now, like it wasn't 10 years ago, but it's, those kind of solutions and, things that you can learn like that are definitely readily available online. So I don't think math should scare people, because it scared me when I first started. I don't think, and I was a limiter. Don't let game math scare you. You already do it every day.
I actually had what's the second worst grade in school in math in in English? In Germany, it's a
D.
5. Okay, in Germany,
Oh, it's a D.
in Germany, we
It's
have
a
numbers.
D.
Yeah, I had a D in math actually, but because I was too lazy to do any work there, doesn't necessarily mean that you're really that bad in math.
No, I mean, I know a few people that have come to me and been like, I hated math, but I understand, 3D math.
Yeah.
I hate, I can't do calculus, but hey, rotations and axes and, points in space make really good sense to me.
And it's also
Great.
important if you're interested in the stuff you're learning. This makes a world's difference if you're actually interested in this kind of stuff. So if you want to build games and you're naturally curious about this, then it will also come more naturally to you than sitting in a boring math class in school.
Exactly. And you learn along the way. By the time you've built your first kind of throwaway prototype, you'll know a lot more math than you think you did. Just inherently from working with a 3D engine, you'll kind of amaze yourself at how much you know from real life.
Yeah, and they also, as you already said, Unity, they try to make it understandable for humans. So you don't have to create everything from scratch. You have stuff like gravity and this kind of stuff out of the box already. You just have to enable it basically. And then you can set stuff like gravity and friction, and this is you don't have to write the calculations for everything from scratch. I mean, you probably can if you want, but it's easy to get started with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anything like you said, the physics system is very involved, but it's also very accessible. You don't need to know the physics system in Unity in and out to start. You just, they have everything for moving and rotating and, do, like you said, setting gravity and setting animations, and everything is available, and you can go as deep as you want, which is, the nice part.
So basically, when you, for example, what I also saw in my beginner tutorial, when you just place stuff on the screen, it will, of course, float in the air. But then you can put a rigid body component on it, and you tell Unity this is supposed to be a physical object. And then it starts falling down and having gravity.
And then Exactly. Yeah, so, Unity's very smart. They've done a lot of work in the engine. So the way they use, their component system, like you said, you just attach something and all of a sudden it acts completely differently. But it acts the way you would think an object would act with gravity.
Besides building your own little projects for your portfolio, do you have any other tips when it comes to getting a job, anything important? And also what I wanted to ask is, do you put these projects on GitHub, like for app development, or do you have to put them somewhere else? Because one problem I noticed with GitHub is that you have, it's different with large files, right? You need large file storage for some stuff. If they exceed, I think 100 megabyte is, I think, the threshold.
Yeah. So with Unity, GitHub now has had for a long time a Unity git ignore file. So when you create the repository, create it with a git ignore and choose Unity. They have a default one, and anyone that doesn't know what that is, it basically is how the project is configured, and it ignores certain files that are automatically built anyway on your computer when you load up the project. So you use a Unity git ignore. And most things, I have a bunch of small stuff when I was starting out in Unity, and I didn't have to use large file size or large files on GitHub until much later. It's usually the art assets, quite honestly, that make the memory go up that much. So especially with beginning stuff, if you're using they're called primitive objects, but if you're using the default objects in Unity, which are totally fine for these kinds of things, I don't think you'll really need the large file. That shouldn't stop you. I don't think you'll need the large file stuff.
Yeah, large file is actually 100 megabyte per file. So as far as I know, so if you don't have any zoned files or stuff like that is that big, then you can actually get along without a large file storage. But even then, it's not a big deal. For example, if you use the GitHub desktop client, then it will set up everything for you automatically. You don't even have to set this up yourself. And it also gives you the git ignore file you mentioned for Unity. This is also set for you automatically. You just have to select it.
Yeah, I love the GitHub desktop app. It's so much nicer than how the terminal used to be. But let's see. You asked the first question. I'm sorry, we jumped right to GitHub. Oh, what should they have? to get a job. Okay, so the other things, this is just seems to me how software recruiting and software industry works. I don't necessarily agree with having to know this stuff right off the bat for an entry-level position because it's things that you can learn on the job. But anytime you see a software development kind of like job requirement, a lot of the time it is more computer science focused. So you'll see things like knowledge of algorithms, knowledge of data structures, knowledge of, CPU or GPU optimization, knowledge of design patterns, knowledge of, functional and object-oriented programming, or what, like a lot of things that a computer science, graduate would know. And like I said, if you're going into an interview, I would at least be able to talk about these things because you're going to get asked. You can get away with being honest and being like, well, I know what they are. I've had some experience with them, but I'm not, at a super high level with these concepts. Like there's no shame in saying, in being honest about your capabilities. But you will run into a lot of these more CS leaning requirements a lot of the time, even in game development, especially for programmers.
But you can learn the stuff on the job. Oh,
yeah. You can learn the stuff on the job, and there are a few really good books. Again, like MIT Courseware has courses for this. There are a few. I found some really good, because people have asked this question a lot. So there are a couple of really good GitHub repositories that sort of have compiled some really good resources or like do-it-yourself curriculums in terms of like a good balance of game design and programming and computer science topics. And that really helped me out. So like, what I did when I was starting out was I went and looked at the course requirements and reading lists for basic computer science courses in universities. And I found that a lot of them use the same books. So I read those books. It's, you're not getting the degree, but you can definitely read the same things that, the computer science students are reading.
And besides getting a job, another big dream for many people interested in game development is, of course, having their own indie games on an app store, for example. Mm-hmm. This seems very appealing because then you can create the whole thing by yourself, and you not only create a small part of the game, but you create the whole game with the story and everything. And what do you think about the mobile indie market? How realistic is it for someone to actually make sufficient income to survive from it by creating their very own indie games? What do you think about that?
Oh, I think, it's always hit or miss. But having said that, if you're going to make a game and you want to make money, especially on mobile, you're going to go for like the casual indie game market, which is basically games that you can play on your ride to work. It's not something that you need to have a story for. It's not really anything that you need, to be involved with, but it's challenging enough that someone will still pay attention while they're doing something monotonous, like they did being on a train or something going to work. Indie games in like larger content, like larger indie games that are like fully featured and have story and all this, it's a lot easier now to make them. I'll say that, like you can cross-publish to like PlayStation and Xbox and all that stuff from Unity, even if you wanted to. Everything's a lot more accessible nowadays, but I don't think that's...
It's definitely difficult to build a really good game because you have to do more stuff than just writing code. You need graphics and sounds and a story and everything. But yeah, some smaller casual games, I could imagine building them.
Yeah, especially on mobile, like that's a big market. Like you might have to make a lot of them to like get a hit and to get enough experience to see what people actually want to play. But the casual gaming market is still pretty open for indie developers.
And if someone wanted to build a bigger game with a story and everything, and they have the patience for it, first of all, I want to say they should probably make sure that it's something that they enjoy the process, because they can't be guaranteed that they actually have success with that. So if you like doing that, then that's something they can try out. But how would you go about finding graphics and sounds and stuff like that? Would you try to hire someone? Would you go to Fiverr, or how would you do that? Because just want to say, it's completely different from coding, right? Coding is just
Oh
one
yeah.
part, but you also need these assets and everything.
Oh yeah. So like programming, design, audio, art. Those are usually the four main pillars that you would either specialize in your career or specialize in school. You can do some of those, still being a programmer. I don't have, sometimes you just do need an artist or art assets and you can't do it yourself. Unity is a great, like the Unity Asset Store, great place to go. Free assets everywhere. Even the paid assets start at, kind of nothing, and you get the rights to publish and whatever. So there's no licensing or anything. There's no issues once you publish. If you wanted something more custom, I don't know. I would still look for conventional artists that have 3D experience. I mean, these are just, I find that the best relationships and the best kind of people that you find are through like enjoying their work. So if there are games that you like, find out who did the art. Like it's really that simple. Like if you like assets on the Unity Asset Store, but they're not quite what you want, like email the artist, email the publisher. Like, can you make something custom for me? There's no harm in asking and like admiring or asking people that you admire, like, are you available for work? Maybe they won't be, maybe they will be. But there's definitely a large community around game development. Like, and you don't need, like I said, you can do all of this, for free or to nothing to a certain level. Like, you're not going to get, something, crazy like AAA games have, but you can do this. Like, it's possible to do this for very little money.
Yeah, I've actually seen some dev blogs on YouTube where people build games and they create all these assets by themselves. Usually this is pixel art,
yeah.
because pixel art is something you can learn relatively easy. And you can even
Mm-hmm.
make your own sounds. There are tutorials for that, how to create sounds with your mouth, for example, and they sound like game sounds then. So it is possible to do this by yourself.
Oh yeah. And like like you said, there are tutorials on Blender for for Maya or 3D Max or the core 3D modeling programs. And there are tons of YouTube videos about how to make simple assets. Like it's very learnable.
Yeah, I've also built some models with Blender. So it is something you can learn.
Yeah, it's perfectly learnable if you want to. But if you're like, that you like programming and, you make some connections and find some like-minded people that have other skills, like use that. That's how this all works.
One thing that's still left then is writing a compelling story, depending on the style of the game. Do you have any tips for that? Does it help if people, it probably helps if people play a lot of games themselves, so they get an idea for that and also game mechanics.
It does.
But what about, for example, reading books? Does reading fantasy books help you with building a good game story?
I don't think it's necessarily like they will help you because it's creative and it's imaginative. I don't necessarily think that a style of book is going to help. It's kind of like being a screenwriter, I would imagine. Like if you read, kind of core books around what makes stories good and like why, human psychology likes certain parts of stories, and you definitely need to read about like user engagement and like how people really play games, because game stories, while the big studios, they're kind of like movies, like you kind of just play them and it's really cool and there's cutscenes and all that stuff. If you're making, a game that doesn't necessarily have that, you really do need to understand what drives humans to enjoy your product. And that's out there. Like there's a ton of books about like how to write engaging stories, how to write narratives, how to, keep your readers or your players engaged in what you're doing, how to keep them coming back, what kind of core mechanics that are playable make games really kind of addictive in a good way, not in a bad way. But like everything, when you watch a movie, everything, games are kind of, in my mind, like when you're writing a game, you want to think about like what parts of your favorite movie would you want to play and why? Because that's really where your engagement is, like the static, non-interactable movie if it's captured you that much, like what if you could play it? Like what would you do?
That seems like a good approach. I've also I've not read real books about game design, but I've read some gamification books. Gamification, I know that you have some experience with that. I saw that on your LinkedIn. I was interested in this topic because gamification is when you apply game mechanics to real life stuff, right? I
Correct.
was interested to gamify my personal to-do lists and stuff like that. So this is why I read some books about this. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that you need some knowledge about game design to make your game interesting. You can't do that intuitively usually because you need to understand a little bit about human psychology and what keeps them motivated. But it can all be learned, as you already said.
Oh yeah. Again, like this is all stuff that is accessible at a basic level, and if you want to go farther, you can. But all this information is, once you start reading about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense because I do that. Like it's very easy to quantify and sort of check off like, oh, this makes sense because I'm a human and I know that I have done that. Like I know that that's how I have responded.
One other thing I wanted to mention is that I've already talked, or I've briefly mentioned dev logs before that some people do. They create games and they document the process by creating these summaries on YouTube. And I just want to mention for people who watch this and who want to build their own indie games, this is a great way of marketing. So instead of just sitting down at home and building it all by yourself, it's a really good way of marketing your game and creating interest by creating these devlogs on YouTube. I'm a big fan of them, and I think they are really smart, really good way of creating some hype around your game and actually getting sales then. This is just something I want to mention because many people make the mistake that they just sit at home, do this, and they hope one day when it's finished, they bring it out and people buy it. But this is usually not how it works. Marketing is important.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you don't have to give away your whole game, but especially if you are saying what you've already tested at home and you're like, well, I'm going to show you how I built my enemy mechanic from the ground up, like just a small piece, and then you can link them to your bigger GitHub project or whatever you want to do. There's definitely, like you said, the marketing of it, but also the engagement from the community and sort of passing on what you learn is very important.
And I really enjoy watching these devlogs. They can be super interesting, seeing how someone builds a game. And then just because you watch this, you can become a fan, and then you are suddenly interested in this game, even though you would have never found it in another way.
Exactly. And everyone kind of, programming, even though, it's like anything else creative, even though the rules and the language are set, everyone sort of approaches it a different way. So like you said, it's very easy to watch these and be like, wow, it never would have occurred to me to, make it like that, but that's cool and it works.
Yeah. And what are your own learning resources? I guess you already talked about it, about books and courses. Maybe I can put some links into the show notes later. So what do you yourself use to learn? Do you also, I assume like app developer, you also just type stuff into Google and use whatever pops up there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no magic sauce to that. But nowadays I do tend to look at more code than like tutorials nowadays because, as you get more experienced, reading someone's code is, sometimes even better, like, because you understand the big picture. But I mostly look at people's code on GitHub, usually find that from YouTube tutorials. So like that's usually the way in, is just to type in whatever you want and say, Unity, 3D character controller, floating camera. See what happens. Like, see whose projects come up. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of trial and error, but that's kind of what we signed up for.
And when you learn game development, of course, in the beginning, as everything else, it usually starts out a lot of fun, but then often there's a dip in motivation later. So do you have any general tips for people to stay motivated when they learn game development? And when they work through your book, for example?
Yeah, my book, I have tried to keep it small. It is a fairly thick book, but it's definitely something that you can get through. Like it's not so long and like kind of dry and boring without doing anything. Like you can work through this book. I've had someone work through it in a weekend. who was like, wow, this was a lot of fun. I got a project, I already knew some stuff, but that was great. For, the burnout or the like trying to keep your motivation up, I honestly, when I get frustrated or, kind of demotivated with my own more complicated projects, I honestly go back and just find some fun, easy tutorial and I do it, because it reminds you that this is fun. And I think a lot of the demotivation in programming in general comes with, coming to a problem and not knowing, like kind of feeling alone and not knowing where to go and like kind of feeling stuck. And, the important thing to realize is that you're not alone. Like, go to Stack Overflow, go start talking to people. Like, this is how you get better. It's as much as this is sort of a solo sport, I would say in the long run, programming is a team sport, because you're never going to do it entirely by yourself. Like, no one's born knowing how to program. You have to learn. You have to talk to people. You have to get stuck and break things and fix it. So that's sort of my 2 cents. But I love just going back and doing things that I know are sort of completable. Like, that there's no like, won't this work? Like, go back and do something easy and fun. Like, go to do some of the beginner, intermediate Unity Learn tutorials.
Yeah,
like,
makes sense.
That stuff is heavily vetted. Like, there's no, uncertainty, I would say, when you're doing that. So let it go, breathe, relax, have fun, and then go back to your project.
And do you have any particular communities that you like to write with other game developers besides Stack Overflow? Reddit, maybe? Do you use Reddit for that?
I read Reddit. I don't actually post, but I do a lot of work with the Ray Wenderlich website, when they have iOS and Unity. So I'm on both of those teams. And even before I was involved with them in a professional way, like, that was my go-to to like talk to people on discussion boards, connect with the authors, connect with communities, just put questions out. Like, I've put questions on Quora before, like hard programming questions, and I've gotten answers. Like, just see what's out there.
Okay, so those are some tips about learning. And I was also interested in hearing, are there any, you already mentioned that you have experience with C++ before, and I was curious, C# is pretty similar to C# is pretty similar to Java, and in our community in Android development, where I'm mainly active, people tend to dislike Java now because it was replaced for a more modern language. I was curious, what do you like and what do you dislike about C#?
I like C# because it's one of the more readable languages when you write your own code, and it's closer to human than it is to machine, right? Like, that's kind of the scale that you're always measuring. Is it super low level and you have to really be super specific and it's not grammatically correct when you write it? That's a very low level. C#'s in the middle to high. It's easy to understand when you're reading it if the variable names are good. Like, it all depends on who's writing the code. But I don't really have any complaints about C#, honestly. I like that they keep trying to not only simplify the syntax, but to make it more human readable, which is great. Like, each new edition that comes, or each new version that comes out, you do see the language evolving to be more readable, which is, in my mind, really great. Like, that's why I love Swift, because it's almost grammatically correct when you write it. And that, there's a lot of work that goes into that. So you can't really change. You can't expect older, more established languages to sort of make that change. But yeah, C#, I think C# and maybe Python are really good languages to start in.
And how does memory management work in C#? Is it like in Java where there's this automatic garbage collection? Or
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So you can absolutely manage your own stack if you want. But yeah, everything happens automatically if you're not kind of digging through that, which is why it's one of the reasons why I like suggesting it as a first programming language.
Yeah. And also one common question is Unity versus Unreal Engine. Which one is better?
Oh,
And why did you choose Unity? Unreal Engine seemed to me more complicated, but I don't know if that's actually true.
let's see. All right. So when I was working at Microsoft, we worked with both. And to be fair, and for full disclosure, my experience with Unreal Engine is very basic. I can make simple things. Most of my experience with Unreal has either been in virtual reality or mixed reality, like augmented reality. So I chose Unity again because back when I started, it was the hobbyist engine. It was for people that just wanted to experiment and to kind of learn. And Unreal was like the big boy engine that had like, you had to really know what you were doing. And plus, like, you had to learn C++. It's very graphics heavy. Like Unreal, the rendering pipeline is really advanced. The interface is much more, I don't want to say cluttered, but it's not as intuitive as Unity's, in my opinion. When I opened up Unity for the first time, I was like, oh, okay, this isn't too overwhelming. They've got some windows and everything's there. And when I opened up Unreal for the first time, I was like, oh God, there's so much. Like, it's just so much. But it also depends on what you want to do. Nowadays, Unity is kind of going toe-to-toe and feature for feature with Unreal. Now, there are some places where each of them still have kind of a leg up on each other. But I honestly chose Unity because that was kind of like the learning engine. C# was easier than C++. Unity was a little easier to learn than Unreal, and that's how I got in. And then, when I was like, well, okay, now that I'm experienced enough, let's try Unreal. I couldn't switch my mindset over to it. That's not to say you can't. I've met a couple people that, do both, and it's perfectly fine. I think you should use the engines for what they're best at. If you need some really heavy, like, graphics processing, and you're really involved in what the game looks like, and you also want some really cool features, maybe use Unreal. If you're looking for, a more intuitive engine interface or game engine interface with a lot of the same features, I'd go with Unity. It's all about preference, really, because they both do, at the core, they do the same thing.
Okay, and besides writing a book, have you ever thought about making videos on YouTube?
Not on YouTube. I have several courses, several video courses on LinkedIn Learning and Pluralsight. Mostly iOS, but I do have a couple, especially on Pluralsight. I have a couple Unity ones and some courses on C# design patterns.
Yeah, I should probably put links to them as well into the description box. People are probably curious to find them.
Yeah, I'm gonna, that might be a next step. I've always wanted to try and do YouTube or something like Udemy. I've always wanted to put something on a platform like that and see what happens.
Yeah, YouTube is a good way for marketing in general. Ad revenue tends not to be so much, especially not when it comes to content that's educational. Entertaining content is better in terms of ad revenue, but it's a good way to market your stuff. That's what I see YouTube as. So those were basically my questions about game development. Is there anything I didn't mention that you would have wished me to ask?
No, you cover. I'm really happy that we covered a lot of the things, like how to get a job and what you want to, what you should be learning. That kind of stuff, I think, gets swept under the rug a lot, and I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Yeah, it's important. And I will put a link to your book into the description box with a discount code, right?
Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And also links to your courses that we mentioned, and anything else that was mentioned in this episode. And then my last question is, where can people find out more about you if they want to stay connected to you?
I'm most active on LinkedIn, so you can find me, just type in my name. I also have Twitter and Instagram if you want, Journeyman Programmer and Journeyman Coder. And I'll send you all those links. But most of the time, just message me on LinkedIn or something. I do get a lot of messages, and I'm available to help people if they get stuck in the book or just, after the book. I've had a couple people, stay in contact and like share some really cool stuff that they've been building, and that's kind of the best part of this, honestly, is seeing who sticks around to like ask more questions or just to talk about, programming or games or whatever. It's nice to build a community like that.
Okay, so again, people can check out all the links in the show notes. And then I thank you for coming in this episode and talking with us about Unity.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Florian.